Good morning. My name is Bluma Grenner, and I'm going to be talking about the spread of HIV in Quebec over the last 18 years. I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. The HIV epidemic in Quebec began in the early 1980s, seeded among men who have sex with men, and it led to a concentrated epidemic with a 15 to 20% prevalence of HIV in the province today among MSM. It is a subtype B infection, and there are high rates of clustering of the epidemic among members of the gay community due to the higher risks for anal route of transmission. 40% of MSM have arrived in Quebec post-2007. There is also a people who inject drug heterosexual epidemic, which represents less than 5% of all cases. It's a historic epidemic, again with clustering in early epidemic, but has declined due to the needle stick exchange programs and antiretroviral subtypes. So we have a continuous introduction of new heterosexual epidemics through migration from the Caribbean and Central and South America. We also have a non-B heterosexual epidemic that has arisen due to migration from Francophone countries at the epicenter of the epidemic in West and Central Africa, including subtypes C, AG, and A and AE. And there has been limited domestic spread of non-B subtypes through migration. So it remains vital to have a means to study an epidemic among individuals, and phylogenetics provide unique insights into the spread of HIV. If we look at the epidemic, we can use phylogenetics to monitor the spread of the HIV epidemic in clusters and to follow the epidemic over time. As you can see, since 2007, there has been a decline in the number of new infections due to the introduction of optimal heart with single pill dosage and pre-exposure prophylaxis and the introduction of integrase inhibitors. Nonetheless, large cluster outbreaks of individuals in which 6 to 150 people share a common virus is relatively common, and this represents over 60% of the epidemic in 2017. And we have non-B subtypes, which reflect the other half of the HIV epidemic. If we examine new MSM cases, we can see that the number of new cases belonging to large clusters have remained rather steady at approximately 150 people belonging to large cluster outbreaks, and this despite the decline in singleton and small cluster outbreaks, was what we anticipated with the introduction of the 90-90-90 treatment as prevention paradigm. So we see that large cluster groups are representing a higher proportion of infections. And to further examine this, we use phylogenetic linkage using HIV Trace, a platform developed in San Diego to monitor the HIV epidemic. This cluster type of presentation is recommended by the USA and the HIV epidemic introduced in 2019, in which the idea is to tailor interventions to specific areas where there are large cluster outbreaks. And here we see specific populations that are at high risk. And one thing you see the large yellow cluster represents over 150 people sharing a common virus, in which you see 3 cases added in the year 2017. Clusters can spread, and as shown in the blue cluster was a Montreal cluster, which had a limited expansion up until 2015, and it has moved over into Quebec in which a secondary wave has taken over that province and that city in the province, and 9 people were added in 2017. So by doing this, one can see which clusters are expanding in any given period of time. If we look at a heat map to explain how large clusters have persisted over time, one can see that individual clusters illustrated on the right, the different 50 clusters, expansion is not simply over the narrow framework of primary HIV infections, where like small clusters where 2 to 5 individuals share a common virus that spread and end. These large cluster epidemics have expanded over extended periods of time beyond 6 months, piggybacking on themselves. And there is yet a fashion in which these epidemics represent more transmissible species that persist over time and can result in multiple waves of transmission. The upper quadrant shows clusters before the year 2010 that have somewhat abated over time, and we get isolated cases. In the second quadrant, you see epidemics that have arisen post 2010. They may have arisen from a virus much earlier, but they're also a limited size. But what we see in the last quadrant are actively growing large clusters that persist over time that exist in 2019. The cluster 163, that was the yellow cluster in the trace map, shows high periods of rapid growth, and the epidemic is persisting over time. Large cluster outbreaks in our studies appear to be interlinked with younger populations in which over the majority, 35% of people in large clusters are individuals under the age of 30, and these within the large younger populations, they are spreading more rapidly. If we look at the demographics, one can see that one can study independent epidemics in individual cities and monitor the spread. And this is Quebec City, which has fewer epidemics than Montreal, can depict that in Quebec City, beyond having men having sex with men epidemics, we also have heterosexual epidemics spreading. Large on the left-hand side, you can see large cluster outbreaks of pink, and that was a early people who inject drug using epidemic that was more apparent in Quebec City. But what you can also see is the rise of a large cluster of subtype T existing, in which there are 18 women infected and 2 men belonging to this cluster. So showing that interventions are also necessary for new immigrant populations to assure that there is no transmission in this group. And to think that this doesn't exist, in 2019, we have a brand new cluster of 9 new people infected in Quebec City. So taken together, our data shows that phylogenetics provide a framework to reconstruct transmission networks. There are sporadic clustered outbreaks that allow HIV to persist in the treatment and prevention era. We need to be able to identify and respond to these newly emerging clusters, to tailor interventions to avert the generation of species that are more infectious. And as the US and the HIV epidemic, we must add a 4th pillar of phylogenetics to HIV surveillance. I would like to thank Michel Roger for his participation, and he's head of LSPQ now, and Isabel Hardy for helping provide sequences and for 50% of the epidemic that was sequenced in our laboratory, and for David Stevenson assisting, helping us design phylogenetic methodology. Thank you very much.